3, 2, 1, off we go. So ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I'm very honored and very happy to talk to Professor Daniel Mahoney, a great expert when it comes to the history of anti-communist resistance, of course, a scholar of Solzhenitsyn, someone who wrote an incredible number of pieces on political theology and political philosophy in the great classical tradition. He has produced many books, and they discuss the problem of classical liberalism, the problem of freedom in general. He has produced a large number of essays on Tocqueville, as well as on Pierre Manon. But today we are discussing the great event of the late 1989 winter, and that is the fall of communism, the fall of Berlin Wall, and the collapse of a very evil system that has plagued the lives of millions, of hundreds of millions of people, and that still seems to be affecting the lives of the Chinese and other nations. So, Daniel Mahoney, it's an honor, it's a joy to be talking to you right now.
Well, thank you, Mihai. Great pleasure to be speaking to you and to your friends all over the world, including your Romanian compatriots.
Well, the Romanians know you already because two of your great books on Solzhenitsyn have been produced, have been translated into Romanian. We are looking forward to seeing your next book about humanitarianism as the heresy of the age, the idol of our age. But let's now go back to this amazing conservative triad that has produced the Annus Mirabilis, the 1989 miracle year. That is, of course, Ronald Reagan, John Paul II, and Margaret Thatcher. Everybody talks about them, but let's pause for a while and look at the political qualities of these great statesmen, because Vatican is also a state, not just a religious center. So
at least since 1929.
It's a pretty recent modern state. Yeah. But what were the political qualities of these individuals that made them align into one direction, that's attacking communism and destroying it?
Let me start with the last great figure in the trio, which is Pope John Paul II. Pope John Paul II, of course, had a direct and extremely concrete experience of totalitarianism in the 20th century. You know, he was part of an underground seminary during World War II in Krakow. It was forbidden for young men to study for the priesthood. He, of course, was Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow for a long time. And he was a man, I think, who was very much a Polish patriot, and a man who was given some deep and important theological reflection to the idea of the nation and the role of it in the the economy of things, including the theological economy of things. But I think John Paul II, when he became Pope in the fall of 1978, provided an element of hope that had been absent for a long time. I think he knew the specific vulnerabilities of communist totalitarianism. And he, contrary to what many academics and specialists say in the West, 1989 was not simply a victory of liberalism over communism, but it was a victory of human nature over the enforced lie. It was a victory of the old nation and the old religions, especially Christianity in its various forms, et cetera, et cetera. And
also a victory, if I may say, just to interrupt very quickly, a victory of personalism over collectivism.
I think that's exactly right. And I would add as an addendum to that remark that John Paul II, who had studied phenomenology, was a specialist on Max Scheler, he was extremely sensitive to the full theological, philosophical, and political meaning of the human person. And I think so many people in the West understand the great binary distinction to be that between individualism and collectivism, which I think is fundamentally a false understanding of politics and the human person. So anyway, I think that first trip in June 1979 to Poland where John Paul II spoke, be not afraid, quoting the words of our Lord Jesus Christ. That was not only a moment where the soul expressed itself in opposition to a kind of soul-crushing ideological despotism, but it was an immense moment of hope that gave rise very, very quickly to things like solidarity and the gradual, of course, there was martial law in 1981, many figures associated with Solidarność, like Valenza and others, were arrested, but it was pretty clear, at least in retrospect, that the political order, the communist order, was doomed because in this playing field between truth, the truth about man, the truth about the human person, and this ideological deformation of politics and the soul, I think the ideologists were bound to lose. So John Paul II crystallized a certain moment. It had been there, the inherent, you might say, human, personal, metaphysical superiority over truth, over the lie, the person over collectivism. That it was preordained, I think, that the human soul would eventually emancipate itself. But John Paul II, his direct experience of things, his philosophical, theological, and political acumen, I think it all came together to crystallize that moment and to speak for Poland, and not only Poland, but the whole Eastern Bloc in all its amplitude. So John Paul II,
he was a prophet. You are saying that from a religious perspective, he was able to see the future. He had a kind of spiritual insight into the future of humanity, which could be, which could be very much flourishing only in the absence of communism. He was also an Eastern European who made a difference, a huge difference, precisely because he had a first-hand experience of totalitarianism. Is that right?
That's right, and that's how I started mentioning his experience, not only of communism, but of Nazism. And by the way, the Catholic Church, I think, on the whole, certainly up through the pontificate of Pope Pius XII, had a very good record in judging and condemning communism. And of course, there were so many heroic figures, Wyszynski in Poland, Cardinal Mindszenty in Hungary and elsewhere. But I think the church took a wrong turn in the 60s. The refusal of the Second Vatican Council to issue a forthright condemnation of communism, the dismissal of Cardinal Mindszenty as Cardinal Archbishop of Esztergom in the early 70s, a policy of Ostpolitik that was in many respects not only, I think, approaching a policy of appeasement, but there were important elements associated with the Roman Church who had bought into para-Marxism, liberation theology,
exactly.
so more, and their judgments of oppressive ideological regimes abstract the treatment of their co-religionists. The sympathy that many progressive Christians had for Maoist China, for example, in retrospect is unthinkable, but it was we see some of this in Rome today. So I think after that 15, 18, 20-year period where Rome wobbled in its clarity in responding to communist totalitarianism, I think there was a restoration of principled good sense. I would also add this. You're absolutely right about the prophetic character of John Paul II, but I would add, he wasn't presenting a philosophy of history in the sense of he knew how history would unfold. He understood what he loved to call the truth about man, a deep spiritual, philosophical, anthropological, and thus political truth. He knew that communism in the profoundest respects was contradictory. And so, of course, that will have consequences in terms of the unfolding of history. But the deep thing is to know one of the great, I think, apologetic arguments for Christianity. You find an argument of this in John Paul II and Péguy and Pascal and others, is that Christianity knows man. And John Paul II, I think, knew just how opposed to the truth about man, communism in all its forms was. I should add, by the way, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn was asked by Yanis Sapiets from the BBC Russian service in January 1979, what he thought of the election of John Paul II, the first Slavic Pope, and Solzhenitsyn said, "Words fail me, it's a gift from God." And it's very hard not to see this as a profoundly providential moment. Let me move on to the other two political figures. I think Ronald Reagan was a man who was constantly underestimated by the intellectual elites in the West. He was accused of naivete, of stupidity, etc. In fact, a perfectly intelligent man. He was a well-read man. He was not an intellectual, but he had read authors that mattered, like Whittaker Chambers, the author of Witness, the famous ex-communist who not only had exposed the treason of Alger Hiss, but more deeply had confronted the battle of the human soul against communist mendacity and totalitarianism. He had read Solzhenitsyn and others.
And Hayek too, and William Buckley.
All of them, and probably the more immediate political influence.
And the Bible, should we add?
And the Bible. A very American mix, Mihai. A very American mix. But he had, I'll never forget, I'm older than you, so I well remember when he spoke to a conference of evangelical leaders in Orlando, Florida in 1983, and he said, the Soviet Union is an evil empire and it will perish. He also gave a great speech at the London Parliament in 1982, where he laid out in a almost prophetic way, because it would unfold so quickly, but he laid out all the pathologies and debilities that were intrinsic to communism. And again, like John Paul II, he envisioned a future where the truth would win out over mendacity, where human ingenuity and spontaneity and enterprise would win out over drabness and conformity and collectivism. That clarity and that determination. By the way, he was willing to work with Gorbachev, but I think unlike so many in the West, he didn't see Gorbachev as a figure who was rehabilitating or revising or restructuring communism. He saw this as the last gasp of Soviet communism. He gave a beautiful speech at Moscow State University in 1988 during his last visit to Moscow and the Soviet Union. And he said things that no other American president would have said. He quoted great Orthodox figures. He quoted Solzhenitsyn. He quoted Dostoevsky.
It's like imagining today Donald Trump giving a speech in Beijing in which he quotes Liu Xiaobo, the Nobel Prize winner.
Absolutely. And even in the fall of 1988, Gorbachev did not want to hear that the deepest Russian wisdom was wisdom that had nothing, absolutely nothing to do with Marxist-Leninism or the whole Soviet misadventure from 1917. And I do think there was no fanaticism in Reagan. He was a man who was deeply worried about the nuclear danger to humanity, but he knew that nuclear disarmament and giving the Soviet Empire a monopoly on force in the modern world was an invitation to both the destruction of liberty and the potential self-destruction of mankind. So there was just lucid common sense informed by exactly that principled understanding of human freedom, and whose sources were that unlikely mix, very American mix you mentioned before. And Thatcher, the Iron Lady, she turned Britain around. Britain was becoming a second, or if not a third world country. Spiritually, it was becoming a third world country. It had lost its sense of purpose. It was caught up in a kind of decayed social democracy. The Labour Party was radicalizing, had lost its old firm attitude toward communism. The economy desperately needed to be turned around. Mrs. Thatcher is misunderstood. All her critics see her as a 19th century individualist who has no understanding of society or no understanding of the human
family.
Yes, but she always spoke in defense of what she called the Victorian virtues and values. Hard work, a sense of community, a sense of charity toward the least advantage, a sense of self-respect and personal responsibility. She was not a narrow individualist.
And she was also a believer. She gave a speech in which she quoted I think, the Reformed theologians of the 16th century as champions of religious freedom, obviously. And she was somebody like who was coming from a Protestant tradition, but nonetheless, like Ronald Reagan, deeply into the Bible. She was very much, I think, a believer.
And I think many of those social themes, the emphasis on personal transformation, personal responsibility, hard work, but also fellow feeling and charity. Much of that reminds me of the Methodism of the 18th century, you know. So yes, she was, again, this is a kind of Christianity that's perfectly at home with a civilized, moderate, classical liberalism, very distinctive to the Anglo-American world. She had, again, clarity about communism on the ideological plane. Perhaps when Gorbachev became head of became general secretary of the Communist Party in 1985, she, at first, you know, she famously said, "I can do business with this guy," and you know, from time to time, her judgment wasn't perfect. I think she was too worried in 1989, 1990 about German reunification, but she came from that generation who remembered the war. And we all know today that it's not German revanchism, maybe on the economic plane, but when it comes to the military projection of power, the big threat today, especially in the younger generation, is pacifism, not imperialism or revanchism. But nonetheless, you know, her prime ministership enabled this great partnership. John O'Sullivan, I think, has written about it in a very able and accessible way in a book he wrote about these three great figures, and that in a time of decadence, in a time of decline, in a time when the Western intelligentsia had turned toward anti-communism, absolutely false belief that the West is a uniquely culpable or guilty civilization, to have these three self-confident figures who drew on the best religious resources, the best philosophical resources, and the best political resources, the confidence in human freedom, rightly understood. It was a golden moment.
Exactly. It was a moment of great inspiration for these leaders. Of course, they were building a friendship among themselves. They were having also personal relationship. They would visit each other. They would talk to each other. I know that at least 15 times Ronald Reagan, Mr. Reagan, talked to Pope John II, John Paul II, especially after the assassination attempt. He was persuaded that God has called him to something very special in terms of, you know, a sense of mission. And I'm wondering to what extent we have at this moment in the West leaders that actually perceive that the political job they have to carry out is also a kind of spiritual mission that they have to at least limit the amount of suffering and slavery that we are witnessing today with communism.
You know, already in the 1940s, Georges Bernanos, the famous French novelist, Catholic essayist, and thinker, wrote about this, what he called the DeSpiritualization of the West, the loss of confidence in our spiritual foundations. You know, many of my French friends have written about, in shorthand, they speak about it as the 68 moment, but that moment when Western elites began to crystallize an understanding of Europe that was post-Western, post-Christian, even in a way post-political, the dream of a world without borders, where Europe...
philosophy, yeah.
Yeah, a world, my friend Pierre Menand puts it, a liberty without law, like the moral law, in a world without borders. You know, that is, in many respects, the
recipe for chaos.
Yes, that's right, and for spiritual and political self-destruction. So because of that, we certainly have some capable political actors in Europe today, but none of them have that sense of civilizational purpose that these three great men and women we've been talking about had. And none of them have confidence in the West as the West. You know, in other words, what they're defending, this ever greater union in Europe, is a decisively post-Christian and even post-political phenomenon. They don't really envision a Europe that will be a significant political actor in the world. They mainly repudiate the deepest resources of the West. I love Roger Scruton, who's a dear friend and inspiration for me, the great British political philosopher, has spoken for many years about a culture of repudiation.
Exactly.
And I have Richard Legutko, you know, who wrote The Demon in Democracy, the European MP, the
Polish conservative, yeah.
Is a conservative, yes. Legutko says many of us, speaking of himself and others, in East Central Europe, didn't notice the extent or degree of the encroaching nihilism because we were too busy fighting the dragon. And I think what happened is, and Legutko, I don't agree with Legutko and everything, but I think Legutko points out that, we'll put it at a political level, you know, the left liberals in Western Europe, and that includes some of the people who claim to be descendants of the classical liberal tradition, they often feel more comfortable with ex-communist officials and governments in East Central Europe than they do with Christians and conservatives, people who affirm the independence of the nation or the broader and deeper Christian patrimony of the West. That's quite remarkable.
Let's talk about this. Go on.
Yeah, Legutko says, for example, they have many of the same enemies. The idea of truth, not understood narrowly and pragmatically, but substantially. The idea of beauty, so central to your Orthodox tradition. The idea of the nation. Pierre Menand, who you know is a great influence in me, he says, how did we come to confuse the European nation of a Christian mark with its great sense of communion with a pagan ideological notion of homicidal aversion to our neighbors? The fact that the intellectual class thinks that loving your country is an invitation to Nazism and genocide is one of the great absurdities of the age. And so in any case, the postmodern liberal left and the post-communists share the same desiccated conception of politics, of human nature. They want to separate truth from liberty, the human good from human freedom. And by the way, we don't want those united in a theocratic or heavy-handed way, but we want free societies to remember their Christian mark, to remember their biblical and classical inspirations, not at the level so much of institutions, but at the level of a civil society informed by those absolutely essential goods and truths.
So Daniel Mahoney, the question that I have in mind for you is the following. So in a way, these great conservative politicians, and many people forget about this, but they were conservatives, right? They managed to destroy communism. They've killed the beast, so to speak, with the beast with many heads.
And it was a wonderful and famous victory. We have to remember that.
And celebrate it. Right now we have to celebrate.
We have to celebrate it.
But 30 years down the road, the question is, have we won the cultural war? Politically, we won. But culturally and intellectually, why is that conservatives seem these days, both in America, North America, that is USA and China, USA and of course Canada, but also Western Europe and also maybe Eastern Europe. Why is that the conservatives seem not to be that influential these days as in the late 80s with, as I said, National Review and Buckley?
Well, first of all, I do think the Antinomian Spirit of 68 or the 60s or however one wants to put it has made major inroads in our cultural and educational institutions. It dawned on me a few years ago that These activists who are screaming and yelling when the Lagukos and Scrutins of the world come to campuses. In other words, the best, most urbane, most serious conservative thinkers, and they resort to violence and screaming, and lectures get canceled. Physical violence is sometimes used. They're not being turned into little Jacobins in college. They're coming in little Jacobins. So the educational system in England, in the United States in particular, beginning in elementary school, junior high, high school, involves a kind of constant reiteration of the themes of the culture of repudiation. Nothing is taught about the richness of our civic tradition or our larger Western cultural tradition. Americans, for example, young Americans learn about McCarthyism, but not about the evils of communism. They learn that Washington owned slaves, but they don't learn that he thought slavery was an abominable institution, and his will provided for the education and financial support of his slaves for 50 years. They learn, and most of all, they learn, they're indoctrinated in the dual totalitarian movements of our time. Radical environmentalism. By that, I don't mean an ecology tied to a Christian anthropology that emphasizes responsibility and self-limitation. Many of the Eastern dissidents, given the Promethean character of communist goals in economics, were ecologists in that good and humane traditional sense. No, I mean a collectivist project to, in the name of responding to an apocalyptic emergency, invites a new form of centralized totalitarianism. And the other, and the true abomination, is gender theory. Gender theory is as radical a denial of the truth of human nature as Bolshevism ever was. It's a denial of human nature. It's a denial of the complementarity of man and women, which is a central biblical and philosophical truth going back to the book of Genesis. It denies, now the activists and the politicians in the Democratic Party in the United States, they use language like this. I was assigned this gender at birth, as if a doctor arbitrarily decided to name a child a boy or a girl. By the idea that there is a absolute radical and unbridgeable gap between this fiction called gender and physical bodies, the denial that the soul and the body and the spirit form an essential unity, is so destructive of common life. It's now leading to 7 and 8-year-olds being given, or 10-year-olds given hormone blockers, undergoing systematic child abuse, physical transformation that often leads to psychic destruction. So, and this has unfolded extremely quickly in the last few years in the West. And even the churches, there are important figures in the Catholic Church, close to Pope Francis, for example, Father James Martin, who are pushing gender ideology and to replace a traditional or common sense understanding of human nature, human responsibility, the complementarity of men and women. And frankly, I think the churches did not fight same-sex marriage. They did not understand what was at stake. And this relates to my latest book, The Idol of Our Age. When Christianity becomes humanitarianism, the emphasis is on sentimentality and inclusiveness. The Christian thing to do is to approve everything and everyone. And that meant there was something vaguely unchristian about reiterating the truth about man and the complementarity of men and women and the order of things.
Let me also mention that talking about this culture of repudiation, you also can witness these days 2 other sort of attitudes. One is you have to sort of snitch. Can I say that in English? Snitch upon your father and mother. Report.
Snitch is a great word.
Yes, report.
The Soviets used to talk about squealing.
Exactly.
Snitching and squealing.
Exactly. So you have to go and report and say to your principal in school that your mom or your dad prevent you from, say, undergoing like a sex what you call it, like
they call it transformation.
Okay, sex transformation. And then so the parents or the family becomes the enemy, And the other thing is the new institution of censorship. It's unthinkable that these days you have platforms like Twitter, YouTube, and of course Facebook, censoring individuals like Jordan Peterson and other such intellectuals. Of course, Prager University has about 100 videos that have been taken down by YouTube. So I see parallels.
Dennis Prager could not be a better model of civilizational good sense. You know, the idea that somehow he's been reduced to a hater and extremist is a sign of how bad things have gotten.
So you see in an ironic fashion a kind of a reemergence of some communist attitudes and patterns of thinking and also acting, like censorship.
Absolutely. Let me say a few things about this, Mihai, because I think it's an extremely important and pertinent subject. One is Jordan Peterson has written about this eloquently in his introduction to a new edition of the Gulag Archipelago published in London. Chantal Delsol in France has written very eloquently about this. We are suffering from, we are experiencing a new ideological Manichaeanism, which is as ideological and as Manichaean as anything under Bolshevism. The woke left, the social justice left, the mini totalitarians, or fast becoming more than mini totalitarians, they are absolutely certain that they know in every situation, amidst the complexity of human nature and human conflict and disagreement, they always know with apodictic certitude who the victim is and who the victimizers are. They do not believe in the drama of good and evil in the human soul, as Solzhenitsyn puts it, that the line between good and evil does not run through classes or races or sexes or races, runs through every human heart. So they have adopted the absolutely false and destructive ideological Manichaeanism of the hard utopian left. They have applied it in our postmodern, post-Western democratic societies, and they are imposing it in increasingly ugly and coercive ways. So that's a huge part of the problem. Now, Rod Dreher, have you come across that name?
Yeah, we are good friends.
Oh, good. You know everyone, so I'm not surprised. Rod, you may know, is writing a book on this subject and has been doing a lot of traveling to the former Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, because Rod interviewed me for the book last year at a conference we were at Notre Dame, and he said he's talking to so many people from the former Eastern Bloc, many who live in the Western democracies, who are appalled by patterns of thinking, patterns of behavior, patterns of excommunication, the kind of Manichaeism I talked about that reminds them in a kind of chilling way of what they experienced before 1989. So I think it's this parallel, which is not artificial, which is not, I mean, it's real, it's concrete, it's before us. We have to highlight this. I'm glad Rod Dreher is writing his book, because we're dealing with nothing less than a new totalitarianism. Now, it's not, we don't see the gulags yet. We don't see the elimination of political freedoms, thank God, so we can still have things like Trump's election and Brexit. But our cultural institutions have been colonized. And already in the universities, something like a semi-totalitarianism has made its presence known. So this yeah, go on.
Yeah, speaking of Donald Trump, this is the last part of our interview. Speaking of Donald Trump, of course, we all hope and pray that he will be re-elected, at least here in Eastern Europe, because he did a lot of good things when it comes to empowering the Eastern European nations, the Eastern Front of NATO, and so on and so forth. Now, the question is, well, how would you see his second term? Because the first term of Mr. Reagan was focused on the American economy, the second term more on liberating nations from Eastern Europe. What about China as the arch enemy of the liberal order, so to speak, classical liberal order? Do you see China as a huge threat, and how do you see Trump fighting it?
Well, those are all good questions. And by the way, I remember the Warsaw speech last year or the year before by Trump. He has a certain sympathy for the peoples of East Central Europe. More sympathy, I think, he has
He was married to 2 Eastern European girls.
That's right. And by the way, his Slovenian wife is extremely decent and charming, and is hated by the American press for all the right reasons, in the sense she's a dignified woman and they hate her. She's not woke, and she's married to him, and we could go on about that, but the press has revealed its ugly nature once again. Yeah, about China, I think Trump, in his guts, many of his judgments are rooted in his gut. You know, use that English word, his belly.
Gut feeling. It's a gut feeling, yeah.
A gut feeling. I think he knows that China is on the move, that it's not, as many people falsely thought, beginning with Deng Xiaoping's reforms, evolving into a middle-class, semi-liberal society. He knows that's bunk. He knows that they have a sense of destiny and see themselves as replacing the liberal order of the West as the sort of dominant, determining feature of international politics and geopolitics for the coming generations. I think he also knows, he's been careful, for example, about Hong Kong. He's expressed sympathy for the students and for Hong Kong society. You look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong knows that unless they do something, they're going to be submerged into this totalitarian Chinese order. And he knows they cheat. We can't trust their economic statistics. Economists pretend these growth rates the Chinese put forward are true. I don't believe them for a minute. I mean, obviously, there's been serious economic growth, but they manipulate, as all totalitarian states do, these kinds of statistics. And I think what's happening, the continued persecution of Christians in China, completely ignored, by the way, by the Sinophiliacs in the Vatican who have betrayed the underground church. And, Archbishop Chaput in Philadelphia told me that the head of the Patriotic Church in China, the ones that the Vatican now recognizes the head of the Chinese church, he's a member of the Chinese Communist Politburo, and he's had a wife for 30 years. We don't do that in the Catholic Church. So, these are who we're doing business with. So I think Trump's instincts with China are good. They're wary. They're not aggressive. They're defensive. But they've shown a realism about Chinese economic policy, Chinese foreign policy, and Chinese domestic policy that has simply not been there since Nixon and Kissinger went to Beijing in February '72.
That's quite remarkable.
It's quite remarkable. That's the thing about Trump is he doesn't read books, as far as I can tell, very often, but his instincts are remarkably good. His personality's messy and undisciplined, but he's the only, as Charles Kessler, the editor of the Claremont Review of Books, has written, he was the only Republican who ran in the 2016 cycle who had the guts, the determination, the good sense to tell the new political class where they could go. Now, speak for that 50% of the American people who have not had a voice for a generation.
We are recording this on December the 19th, 2019, and the question is, will Mr. Trump be impeached?
Well, actually, he was just impeached by the House, but convicted. No, he won't. First of all, I think what's going to happen in the new year is indictments are going to come down from the prosecutor Durham in Connecticut, who is investigating the role of the Obama government officials and FBI and CIA officials in opening, and this is quite startling in the United States, a counterintelligence and domestic crime investigation on a man running for president, one of the two major political parties. They talk about a telephone call between Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and the president. We had a 2.5-year episode, maybe 3-year episode, where President Trump was accused of treason. He was accused of being an agent of Vladimir Putin. He was accused of stealing the election. The hysteria, the falsehoods, the mendacity, the FISA warrants, was based on this
hearsay, GPS fusion.
Yeah, which was paid for by Hillary Clinton. None of this is being investigated by a democratically controlled House of Representatives. But it is I don't usually like to talk hyperbolically, but it's not hyperbolic. This was something like a coup attempt, an effort to undo the election of 2016. The fact
By the way, in the conversation, may I just say, because I come from Eastern Europe, may I just say that in that conversation, what Mr. Trump said to Zelensky, the president, he said something that we hear every day from Brussels, that is, fight against corruption, move on with your institutions, don't stop there, keep on trying to, reform your judiciary and so on and so forth. So basically what Trump told Zelensky is a commonsensical line, do your job, nothing else.
And by the way, we have it on tape. Vice President Biden, who had been put in charge, his only real portfolio under President Obama was Ukraine policy. He told the media that he had told the foreign minister, the Attorney General of Ukraine, that if you investigate the company,
the former president,
if you investigate the company my son's associated with, all aid to Ukraine will be cut out. That was never investigated. Is there a better example of corruption? So anyway,
and may I also ask you, is Hunter Biden associated? Was he associated with a Chinese company as well?
He was.
So in a way, you see this pattern, right? These corrupt politicians in Brussels and in Brussels and in Washington, D.C., they all have some connections to totalitarian regimes. They are bought off by these totalitarian governments, be they Iranian, Chinese, or Russian, and then they pretend to be innocent when they are exposed. Yeah,
that's exactly right. But I think you look at the vagaries, the vacuity of the impeachment articles, abuse of power, no specific abuse of power mentioned. They had been, they talk about Trump committing treason. Trump is an extremely patriotic man. He has not committed treason. He's not a Russian agent in all of this. They talk this way, but they came up with the thinnest, most vacuous set of charges. They were desperate, and they've taken no responsibility for the fact that the charges against the President of the United States regarding so-called collusion with Russia were groundless. They were calumnies. They were claims that were fantastic in their falsehood, and yet no one in the media and the press, I can tell you, and again, I'm not being hyperbolic, the mainstream press is about 96 to 97% against the president. And yet he still has support of half the American people, and that's rising. Independents are turning back to the president. Republicans are all rallying. In the swing states, I don't know if you've seen these polls.
No.
But in the recent polls, since impeachment began, in the swing states that won Donald Trump the election in November 2016. So that would be Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, several others.
And Florida too?
Yeah, Florida's ahead in all of them, against every single Democratic contender. So this
there are good signs, yeah.
Yeah, this overkill, this, we used to call it Bush derangement syndrome. That was a mild virus compared to Trump derangement syndrome.
I lost a friend. I will not name him, but you know him. He's a Romanian. I lost one important and great friend when I told him that he suffers from this Trump.
Yes.
He lives in Maryland. I will not say more than that.
I know who he is, and he's a prominent political scientist who suffers from Trump derangement syndrome.
I'm afraid that's the case.
I have another Romanian friend who's in Indiana who suffers from a milder version of the derangement syndrome.
I'm really sorry about that, because I think Eastern European intellectuals should see more clearly the Bolshevik tactics of the current Democratic Party. But Daniel, this was a joy, and I'm telling you, your contribution to making great Eastern European dissidents like Havel, like Solzhenitsyn, known to the West on the one hand, but also, of course, your contribution in terms of making great voices from America, like Whittaker Chambers, like, of course, William F. Buckley, known in Eastern Europe is something very special and very precious.
And we need a conservative international, and we need a Christian international. We need those of us who are committed to the same principles of truth and liberty under the moral law, a sound conception of politics that conjugates freedom and responsibility in the right way. Those of us who are patriots, but who recognize common humanity. We're an international. We are national-minded, but we share the same spirit. We are informed by the same writers and principles, and we have to speak to each other in an ongoing and sympathetic way. So it's always a joy to do this kind of thing.
We are universalists. We are not internationalists or globalists, but we are universalists because we
Absolutely.
are Christian.
And by the way, everything people like you and I do, or Roger Scruton and Pierre Menant do, is a way of thoughtfully and humanely conjugating the universal and the particular.
Thank you so much. And
All
let's
right,
hope that
Thank you, Mihai.
let's hope that the intermediary bodies between the individual and the universal will flourish. That's the family, that's the church, that's the civil society and the university. I wish you a Merry Christmas. And
Merry Christmas to you and to all my friends in Romania.
And let's hope to meet again in 2020.
I hope so too.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.